Morning, everyone. I think we'll start while others stream in. My name is Tom Compass. I'm the director of the Crawford School, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this morning. Before we begin, let me just take a moment to acknowledge the first Australians, the traditional owners of the land that we meet on, and to pay respects to their elders, past and present. Today is day 2 of a 2-day event that's celebrating our new Asian Pacific Policy Society that supports the journal that we launched in July, Asia and Pacific Policy Studies. It's a society that's designed to break down barriers across discipline groups, engage with policymakers, and reach into the region to try and answer and solve policy questions and problems that we all care about. Today's session, it's a packed day, a full day-long conference. Standard format, however. 10 world-class speakers, plus me, at the very end of the day. All 10 speakers are either editors of the new journal or society fellows. So it'll give you a good taste of what's coming in the journal and a good taste of what's coming in the engagements that you may experience in the society, the roundtables, workshops, conferences, the web pages, the blog spaces. Everything that happens today will be a good indicator of all that's coming. A little bit of apology from Martin Painter and Henrik Hansen, who were supposed to be on the program today but couldn't make it in the end. But looking very much forward to today and the 10 great speakers that we do have. Let me, before I begin, also acknowledge the generous financial support of AusAid. AusAid is our partner in this endeavor, with a mandate to keep the Pacific in Asia and the Pacific, which we take quite seriously. And you'll see some of the sessions today, in fact, do focus on the Pacific, and rightly so. As I said, the format's pretty standard. I'm just going to let these very good people do what they do best and talk for about 15 or so minutes. And then after, within each session, both speakers, or 2 or 3 speakers have talked, we'll save plenty of time for questions. It's your chance to, in the first instance, throw some questions at the Chancellor, something that's normally very hard to do, very hard to access, so it's a good opportunity. Let me introduce the Chancellor. Most of you will know that Gareth Evans spent 21 years in Australian politics, 13 of them in senior cabinet positions with major portfolios, including Foreign Secretary. He's here today, though not really as the Chancellor, but with a scholarly hat on. Gareth is a professorial fellow here at the ANU. He's published 9 books, more than 100 articles, and countless newspaper and editorial contributions. Actually, too many to count. Quite incredible. His major research and policy interest lately is on nuclear non-proliferation, and in this regard, he's convener of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and chair of the advisory board of the Center for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament, both based here now, I'm proud to say, in the ANU Crawford School of Public Policy. A true luminary. Please welcome the Chancellor, Gareth Evans.
Well, thanks very much, Tom, and good morning, everybody. Sometimes the biggest policy questions of all get much less attention than they deserve. And so it is with nuclear disarmament, an issue that, as we can all recall, in earlier decades mobilised hundreds of thousands of activists all over the world, and was an issue on which every political leader and senior policymaker had to have some kind of opinion, but which now barely resonates at all. The occasional policy wonk and grey ponytail notwithstanding, hardly resonates at all with policymakers and publics. Part of the reason seems to be complacency, the perception that in the post-Cold War world, nuclear stockpiles are not the threat they may once have been. Another appears to be a kind of ingrained fatalism, the perception that nuclear weapons can't be uninvented, are always going to be with us, and that there's little point accordingly in playing Don Quixote. But perhaps most importantly, and in many ways more disconcertingly, is the perception on which I'll focus in this talk, that disarmament is actually undesirable because nuclear deterrence works. Having wrestled with these issues in a variety of incarnations over the years, I really believe that it's critical that all these perceptions be challenged, and nowhere more so than in Asia and the Pacific, which is a very dense nuclear environment indeed, one where every nuclear-armed state, except the UK and France, is a player, although of course France's role in testing in the French Polynesian atolls is not forgotten in the Pacific any more than the US role in testing in the Marshall Islands. But the Asia and Pacific is also an area which, unlike anywhere else in the world at the moment, stockpiles of nuclear weapons in India, Pakistan and China, quite apart from what may be happening at a much lower level in North Korea. Stockpiles in all these countries are actually believed to be growing, not being reduced. So a credible case has to be made in a contemporary 21st century context and focusing particularly on the realities of our own region. Not only that nuclear disarmament is achievable, albeit over a very protracted period, but also that it's highly desirable. And that means, above all, contesting the tenacious belief held by policymakers and those who influence them in nuclear-armed states and their allies, that nuclear deterrence is of real value to their national security and that its benefits outweigh any possible costs. Belief in the deterrent role of nuclear weapons is not the only reason why states acquire and retain them and are reluctant to pay more than lip service to the objective of eliminating them. In particular, for some states, most obviously France, the UK and India, but these days probably including Russia as well, considerations of status and prestige, what I call the testosterone factor, have been and remain absolutely crucial. There's also a lingering concern in some quarters that states may want to possess or acquire nuclear weapons as actual instruments of aggression. But I have to say that I'm not persuaded, I'm not alone in this, in believing that any nuclear-armed or putatively nuclear-armed state in this region or anywhere else in the world, I'm not persuaded they will be willing to break the international normative taboo against any aggressive use of such weapons, which unquestionably now exists. It seems to me that in security terms, it's the deterrent rationale, not any war-making one, which is overwhelmingly the driver. So if movement toward disarmament is ever going to gain real momentum, a strong and widespread belief in the deterrent utility of nuclear weapons in neutralising external threats to national security does need to be seriously challenged. And challenged in the three different contexts, all of which are very apparent in Asia and the Pacific, in which this arises. The first context is what might be called symmetrical nuclear deterrence, where states of roughly comparable size and resources acquire and retain nuclear arsenals, but while not necessarily themselves, the arsenals being of roughly equal size, are nonetheless in each case big enough and secure enough to credibly retaliate after a first strike by their adversary, and which are designed, of course, accordingly to inhibit that adversary from contemplating any such strike. And that's the situation with the United States and Russia, with the United States and China, with Russia and China, and with China and India. The second context, which is an extension of this first one, is extended nuclear deterrence, where a nuclear-armed state operating in what I've just described as a symmetrical deterrence environment extends the retaliatory protection of its own nuclear arsenal to allied states living in potentially dangerous neighbourhoods, with at least part of the rationale being to dissuade those allies who might otherwise be capable of doing so from acquiring nuclear weapons of their own. And that's the situation with respect to the United States, in relation to its non-nuclear NATO allies, and in our own region, it is, of course, the case with respect to the United States and Japan and Korea and also Australia. The third context is asymmetrical nuclear deterrence, where a state of very unequally small size and resources, as compared at least to one or more notional adversary, acquires or retains nuclear weapons with the object of raising the pain threshold so high that would-be regime changers, would-be territory acquirers, or would-be punishers would think again. And that is the case with Pakistan in relation to India, with North Korea in relation to South Korea and the United States. The arguments against nuclear deterrence in these various contexts need to be given much more systematic articulation and exposure than has been common in either the academic or the policy-focused literature of recent years. The arguments are of two main kinds. First of all, those emphasising the fragility of any nuclear deterrence calculation, and secondly, those making clear the highly dubious utility in practice of relying on nuclear deterrence. Acceptance of both these sets of arguments may not be a sufficient condition for changing policy, but they're a very necessary starting point. Nuclear deterrence has always been a fragile basis for maintaining stable peace for three main reasons. First of all, thanks, Doc. First, nuclear deterrence depends on rational actors on both sides, each making rational judgments about the risk factors involved. But political actors and circumstances can change, and it simply can't be assumed that complete rationality will always prevail in the stress of a real-time crisis. As the late and great international theorist, very strongly associated with this university, Hedley Bull, has said, mutual nuclear deterrence does not make nuclear war impossible, but simply renders it irrational. And as he then went on to wryly put it, a rational strategic man is one who, quote, on further acquaintance reveals himself as a university professor of unusual intellectual subtlety. There's not too many of those around in the bomb button pressing business, let me tell you. Secondly, there's an endemic risk not only of human error or misjudgment under stress, but of miscommunication. The risks here very much now compounded by the sophistication of cyber weapons. And there's the risk of basic system error, with harmless events being read as threatening. Much archival evidence of the Cold War years, when command and control systems on both sides were thought to be highly sophisticated, and were in fact rather more so than some between some potential nuclear adversaries today. Archival evidence has now revealed, I haven't got time to go into any of it, but it's out there in spades, has now revealed how close to calamity the world regularly came during the Cold War years, much more so than was understood at the time. It's frankly not a matter of good policy, not a matter of good management, that the world has avoided a nuclear catastrophe, nuclear weapons catastrophe, for the last 67 years. Let me tell you, it's a matter of sheer dumb luck. The third reason for contesting or arguing about the fragility, inherent fragility of nuclear deterrence, is that there's always a risk that new technical developments will make old calculations redundant. In particular, the risk that missile defence systems will be developed that will be extremely destabilising by destroying the adversary's capacity for effective weapons delivery unless he fires first. While it's certainly arguable that the prospect of completely effective and thus destabilising if unilaterally deployed missile defence is much more scientifically remote than is claimed by both supporters and critics, the basic point about technological uncertainty very much remains. Second set of arguments go to the dubious utility, and certainly it is the case that nuclear deterrence has been a much more dubious basis for maintaining stable peace than is commonly assumed. In fact, I believe that all the main arguments in its favour, on closer examination, reveal themselves to have nothing like the force that they're usually seen to possess. First, of course, is the argument that nuclear weapons have deterred and will continue to deter war between the major powers. Well, while nuclear weapons on the other side have always constituted a formidable argument for caution on the part of any major power, it's been argued, I think, quite persuasively that knowledge of the existence of supremely destructive weapons hasn't stopped war in the past, as was certainly the case with chemical and biological weapons before 1939. And very interestingly, I think it can be well and strongly argued that the experience or the prospect of massive damage to civilians, to cities, massive civilian casualties, has not in fact caused leaders in the past to back down, including, very interestingly, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the historical evidence is now pretty overwhelming, notwithstanding all current popular perceptions to the contrary. Historical evidence is now very compelling that it was the Soviet declaration of war that same week, not the nuclear attacks at all, that were the key factor. It was the key factor in driving Japan to sue for peace. It became very important for Japan afterwards to claim that it was this fantastic bomb coming out of nowhere that led them to do the unthinkable and surrender. But all the evidence is now very strong that it was the Soviets coming into the war that was the key decisive factor. And more than that, I think it has to be remembered that and recognised that there's no evidence whatsoever that during the Cold War years, at any stage, either the Soviet Union or the United States was actually determined to go to war at any particular time and only deterred from doing so by the existence of the other's nuclear weapons. So all those arguments about the long peace between Soviet Union and US during the Cold War need, I think, to be rethought. The second argument is that nuclear weapons will deter any large-scale conventional attacks. But there's actually a long list of examples, when you look at the history, where non-nuclear powers have either directly attacked nuclear powers or have not been deterred by the prospect of their intervention. Think in this respect, I won't go into the detail, about the Korean War, Vietnam War, the Yom Kippur War, the Falklands War, two Afghanistan wars, and the first Gulf War. Whether the calculation in each case by the non-nuclear party was that the nuclear taboo or some other factor would inhibit a nuclear response, the point is simply that nuclear weapons did nothing to assist peace and stability in any of those situations. There are also cases where the presence on both sides of nuclear weapons, rather than operating as a constraining factor, has actually been seen as giving one side the opportunity to launch small military actions without serious fear of nuclear reprisal because of the extraordinarily high stakes that would be involved in such a response. Think about Pakistan's crossing the border in Kargil in 1999. Think about the North Korea sinking the Jianan ship and the shelling of Yonpyong Island in 2010. It may in fact be that rather than, as the old conservative line would have it, namely the absence of nuclear weapons would make the world safe for conventional warfare, maybe rather than that, the reality is there's the presence of nuclear weapons that has made the world safe for such wars in the past, at least these situations that I've mentioned. Thirdly, there's the argument that nuclear weapons will deter any chemical or biological weapons attack. This is certainly claimed by some nuclear-armed states and their allies, but, in my view, entirely lacks plausibility. Given that these weapons have nothing like the destructive potential of nuclear weapons, and never will with chemical weapons, although the future risk factor is higher with biological weapons, it's very difficult, I think almost impossible, to paint a plausible attack scenario in which nuclear, as distinct from conventional retaliation, would be a proportional, a necessary, and therefore a credible response. Fourthly, there's the weakest argument of all that nuclear weapons will deter terrorist attacks. Nuclear weapons, I think, hardly need spelling out, are manifestly neither strategically, tactically, nor politically useful for this purpose. Terrorists don't usually have territory, industry, a population, or a regular army, which could be so targeted. And to conduct nuclear strikes on another state, even one demonstrably complicit in a terrorist attack, would raise huge legal, moral, political and strategic issues. If not contemplated in Afghanistan after 9/11, it's very difficult to imagine that such strikes ever would be contemplated in any such context. So I see the task of those of us interested in public policy as being not just analysis but influencing policymakers. And I hope this remains a central objective not only of the Crawford School but of the new Asian Pacific Policy Society and the new journal advancing its aims. What that means for me in the present context and the further development of this paper is refining, developing and articulating these arguments against reliance on nuclear deterrence in a way that has real resonance, not only among fellow academics, but for those working on these issues on the ground. Changing mindsets on deterrence may not, as I've already intimated, be a sufficient condition for moving towards nuclear disarmament, but there can't be much doubt that it's a necessary one. Of course, if the attention of even the most mind-changed policymakers is going to be captured and sustained, there's also a need to focus on achievable next policy steps over the years ahead, bearing in mind that even on the most optimistic view of what's practically achievable, getting to a nuclear weapon-free world is going to be a very long haul indeed. I'm inclined to think that the most useful way forward would be to focus on what I call the 4 Ds: delegitimising, doctrinal change, de-alerting, and then downsizing. But I'll save, given the time constraints, another occasion for spelling out all that might mean. What I can't and won't spare you from is a brief final reminder of why all this matters. Why it matters is simply this: nuclear weapons are the most indiscriminately inhumane weapon of destruction ever invented. Some 23,000 of them still exist, all but a few hundred possessed by Asia-Pacific states, with a combined destructive capability in both blast and radiation terms equivalent to something like 150,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, and extraordinarily with some 2,000 of them maintained on dangerously high launch-on-warning alert. As the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons in 1996 put it most succinctly in words that have since been echoed by many others, so long as any state retains nuclear weapons, others will want them. So long as any nuclear weapons remain in the hands of any state, they are bound one day to be used, if not by deliberate design, then by accident or miscalculation. And any such use would be catastrophic for life on this planet as we know it. And as I've put it on multiple occasions, there's only one other global policy issue which is remotely comparable in terms of its impact on planetary survivability, and that's climate change. But, let me remind you, nuclear weapons can kill us a hell of a lot faster than CO2. Thank you.
Gareth, thank you very much. Our second speaker is Anne Florini. Anne, thank you for coming to the Crawford School. Much appreciated. Anne is internationally recognized as an authority on new approaches to global governance, with a special interest lately in the role of the private sector in solving global issues and global problems. Numerous books, many more scholarly articles in world-class journals, such as Energy Policy, Global Policy, Foreign Policy. Policy is the key word in this work. Professor of Public Policy at Singapore Management University, also a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings. Please welcome Professor Anne Ferrini.
Thanks very much, Tom, and thank you for inviting me to this conference. It was quite a challenge to think of what would be the appropriate topic to bring to a brand new journal and a brand new society at such an eminent institution. Gareth started off by talking about an issue that some issues get too little attention, and spent quite a bit of time on an issue that I agree has gotten far too little attention. I'm going to raise one that is very often not even seen as a public policy issue. And I hope in the next 15 minutes to persuade you that it is not only relevant to public policy, but it is one of the most compelling items on the public policy agenda. And that is the role of business. I would argue that it's no longer wise or even possible to think of public policy solely in terms of what governments do. That the equally important actor is business. Business both for its role in addressing market failures and for its role in playing public policy roles. There have been an enormous number of calls for the private sector to make up for the failures of public policy in countries around the world, in everything from corporate codes of conduct to new business models of social enterprise that aim to save the world while earning profits. But as scholars, as public policy scholars, we don't really understand the public policy roles and impacts that business is already having. We understand even less about the interactions across the thousands upon thousands of initiative codes, social enterprises, private regulatory regimes. We know that they are out there. We've done lots of case studies on individual examples, but we really have no idea what this adds up to. So in my 15 minutes, I'd like to talk about what the public policy research agenda and the policy agenda is that might come out of paying attention to the role of business. Why does it matter? Why do we need to pay attention to the role of business? I think the best way to put it is because we, all of us, humanity, are in a race against time, and it's us versus the externalities. Externalities are defined as consequences of production that are not factored into prices. And the most obvious example is the one that Gareth mentioned just at the end of his talk, climate change. Climate change is overwhelmingly due to greenhouse gas emissions that are overwhelmingly caused by the activities of businesses that are profiting from the activities associated with those emissions. We're now on track, under business as usual, for double-degree temperature increases in the lifetime of children alive today, including my own. The most sober assessments of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, talking about how bad things are actually likely to get, which they started doing in the early 1990s, have been proven over the last few years to be far too optimistic. The damage that we are seeing from the relatively minor temperature increases that have already happened have outstripped their worst projections. The equally sober assessments of the International Energy Agency, which is a highly technically proficient agency, are becoming more and more alarmed at the lack of policy response to this very critical problem, which is essentially a problem of externalities. We're already committed to a planet that is going to see very substantial climate change. Even if we stopped all emissions now, we're going to see substantial climate change, and we're not really doing very much about it. Our public policy failure about dealing with externalities is even worse when you look at ecosystems and biodiversity. we're destabilizing the ecosystems on which our civilization depends at an extraordinary rate. I don't know if any of you have seen this chart before. This was put out a few years ago by a group of leading scientists who were trying to get a handle on to what degree are we actually destabilizing the planet. If you take as our starting point the basic planetary systems that have been in place for the last 12,000 years in the Holocene era, which is where human civilization arose, and those systems are that inner green circle. If we stay inside those boundaries, we don't change very much of anything. And then they looked at a whole bunch of areas where we're making disruptive changes: climate change, biodiversity loss, various chemical kinds of emissions. And they did a few projections as to where are we now versus where would we be pre-industrial civilization. Climate change is that one on top. We've exceeded the boundaries already, but not by that much yet. The very big problem is biodiversity losses, according to their calculations. And there are others having to do with the nitrogen cycle. All of these are externalities from the way we have designed our industrial and agricultural processes. Because those industrial processes are overwhelmingly done by businesses, by corporations, you cannot get away from talking about the roles that corporations are playing, that businesses are playing, if you're talking about the future of the planet. So maybe you can make similar arguments talking about other issue areas as well. Financial instability in the financial system and the role of financial institutions. Perhaps the more academic way to phrase us versus the externalities is to say, because many of the worst crises the world is facing can be defined as externalities created by the private sector and borne at public expense, the role of business is inherently and necessarily and massively a public policy issue. Let me move away from back here if I can. And I now want to start talking in a little more detail about exactly the role of business. There is always, for business, a social contract. It's usually an implicit social contract. Some parts of it are explicit in terms of government regulation. And the traditional social contract is that business does a lot of good things for society. There's a reason that capitalism has spread the way it has spread. It provides wealth, goods, jobs, pays taxes, provides the services on which we all depend. And government, as its part of the social contract, provides the public goods, the infrastructure, education. It enforces the contracts and the property rights without which business can't function. That's the traditional social contract. So the problem of thinking about business and public policy isn't that people in the business world are somehow worse or less moral than people in the public sector. It's not that they are out to be bad for the world. The problem with the social contract that we have been operating under is that it has explicitly said to business, you're not responsible for the externalities. That's a public policy problem. That's up to government to deal with. Famous article by Milton Friedman in the early 1970s about the business of business is business, in which he argued that it was immoral for people in the corporate sector to pay any attention to issues of the kind that I'm talking about, because their only moral responsibility is to their owners, their shareholders, and if they were to spend corporate funds dealing with these other problems, they are essentially stealing from the owner. But if you look at those articles, what he's really saying is, you don't have to worry about the externalities because somebody else will do it. What we're finding under conditions of globalization and current systems of governance is that governments aren't doing it. Nor is there any reason to think that they will or that they can on the scale that is necessary. So the social contract is changing, and businesses are finding themselves under tremendous pressure to change the terms of the social contract themselves, because they are operating globally, and governments, for the most part, have not found ways to balance the global reach of business. So let's think about how the social contract is getting expanded. The most traditional, obvious way, which has been around for a long time, is corporate philanthropy. You show you're a good citizen by, if you're Corporation X, you build a school in some poor community, or you give funds to the local opera. And you plaster your name all over that, and you show, therefore, the citizens of your community what good guys you really are because you're thinking about this broader interest. Philanthropy is not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is a much broader range of corporate responsibilities that go under terms like corporate social responsibility, CSR, corporate citizenship. There's a million terms for it. I'm going to use the label CSR, but I want to make it very clear it's not to be confused with giving money away on the side. CSR used to be about philanthropy, about what do you do with your money. It's now how do you make your money in the first place. That's what this new agenda is about. I'm going to spend a few minutes on this chart. I usually, with my students, spend about a 3-hour seminar on this, so you're going to get the 3-minute version of the history of corporate social responsibility. You got the rise of modern corporations as we understand them in the late 1800s. The first recognized one of which is Standard Oil, founded by Rockefeller. You then got a backlash, and I'm speaking mostly about U.S. history now because this is where this started. You got a backlash against this incredible concentration of power that you got with these initial corporations, which were set up by the American robber barons. You got what were called muckrakers, journalists who went and did exposés on the kinds of activities that these major corporations were undertaking and some of the consequences, social consequences that their activities had. You then got a policy response called trust busting, which was legislation that broke up the largest of these corporations into smaller pieces. You also got the invention of modern philanthropy. John D. Rockefeller, who created Standard Oil, always thought of himself as a good guy who had created this corporate form to do good for the world because otherwise there was no way to create an oil business that was not subject to such great booms and busts that it could never really develop as a field. He took a huge percentage of his fortune and put it into the Rockefeller Foundation, the first of the modern philanthropic foundations, and it's still around today. Then we moved into World War II and then the Bolshevik Revolution. And after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, we got a response on the part of capitalists around the world saying, we have a problem here. And they created the International Labor Organization, the only international organization that explicitly has non-governmental actors as members. Labor and employers and governments are all equal partners at the International Labor Organization. It was an effort to deal with this question of the social externalities of business. And how do you come together to set rules to deal with that? Moving to the 1930s, the Great Depression. Countries responded in different ways, but a great deal of what you got in the United States was the New Deal legislation, a bunch of social protections against the social externalities that business generated. I'll skip over a little bit of this. Through the 1950s and 1960s, you got a whole lot around the developed world, a whole bunch of new environmental and social protections, again, responses to the social and environmental impacts that business was having. At the international level, there was an effort to develop a code of conduct under the UN Center for Transnational Corporations. From the early 1970s to 1992, negotiations were ongoing about what should be the code of conduct to control the international operations of transnational corporations. All of this was spearheaded by developing countries who essentially felt powerless in their relationship with these corporations. Whether they were powerless or not is another story, but they certainly felt that way. It never went anywhere. What you got instead was, in the 1980s, a change in the global zeitgeist about the appropriate role of transnational corporations. You've got the neoliberal revolution. You've got an increasing acceptance of the idea that bringing in foreign direct investment, foreign managerial competence, etc., was a good thing for a country, not an evil to be objected to. And so the UN Center on Transnational Corporations faded away. But in the 1990s, 80s, but particularly in the 1990s, you got from civil society groups tremendous pressure for dealing with the social and environmental consequences of business on a large scale. You've got pressure for codes of conduct, everything from dealing with environment to dealing with fair wages to dealing with, you name it, any consequence that business has, there's codes of conduct around it. You've got the emergence of calls for reporting on your social and environmental consequences. Corporations are all obliged to report financially. Why should they not also be obliged to report what their environmental consequences are and what their social externalities are? I'll talk about that a lot more in a minute. You've got the emergence of a huge number of public-private partnerships between government and business. Some of them efforts to regulate these externalities, some of them efforts to carry out large-scale public goods provisions, and many of those much of that is still developing. And you've got the rise of this idea called social enterprise. Set up a business whose purpose is to pursue profit simultaneously with pursuing an avowed social or environmental goal. That's equal importance. Also a phenomenon that is spreading particularly in Asia. You're getting a lot more attention recently from government to this idea of non-financial disclosure requirements. And where we are now is, what does all this add up to? We don't really know. Just to give you a few examples, some of which you've probably heard of. Global Compact put together by the United Nations a few years ago to bring the world's large corporations together to essentially learn how to be good, truly good corporate citizens in the 21st century. It's a learning model of bringing corporations together with governments and other stakeholders to say, what should your practices be? And how do you think about it? And how do you look inside your own business to understand how it's operating and change the way that it's operating so that you are not generating harm to society? Many of these others are looking at specific areas. Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, certifies whether lumber is being provided sustainably. Has gotten some very large buyers like Home Depot to agree to buy only FSC certified products. So they have to be sustainably produced. You have something similar now for palm oil. You have something similar for fisheries. In fact, in most of these areas, you have multiple and often competing certification processes. There are a lot of these things around, probably several hundred. You also have the emergence of a whole bunch of non-financial reporting standards, the most famous of which is the Global Reporting Initiative, which is rather complex and unwieldy, but rapidly evolving. It's coming out with its fourth set of standards next year. So what? Should we take all of this on as a new research agenda? Should policymakers who already have overflowing inboxes worry about this stuff as well? My argument is obviously yes, that's why I'm giving this talk. And my argument is not only this is something that needs to be added, but that this is something that is absolutely fundamental to what public policy means for the 21st century. It is not an addition, it is, I hate to use this overused phrase, but it's a bit of a paradigm change in terms of thinking about what does public policy now mean. And I want to spend just a minute talking about an individual, because we heard calls last night and this morning for scholars of public policy to engage in the policy process, to bring what we study and we know and to speak out and become active in a way that scholars very often aren't. And I want to give you an example of somebody who has done that, partly as a way of saying this is how we can go about developing a research and policy agenda that actually can have some real impact on the world. This man's name is John Ruggie. Anyone who has studied international relations in grad school has come across work that he did going back to the early 1980s in work on international regimes and how global governance works. Ruggie is particularly famous in scholarly circles for an idea called embedded liberalism. And his argument was that the reason that it was possible for liberal economic models to thrive in the 20th century was because they were embedded in a system of protections that governments had instituted to make sure that people could deal with the consequences of a market economy, that life was not so disrupted that it became unmanageable. then took some of this into practice and went and worked at the United Nations for a couple of years, where he was largely responsible for the Global Compact that the UN put together. He then got called back into the UN to launch a global process for developing a set of principles on business and human rights, because many large corporations were being attacked for complicity in human rights violations, if not actual participation in human rights violations. The Ruggie principles were adopted by the UN General Assembly last year, and a major global effort at implementation is now underway. I'm going to take a few seconds to say why this is relevant to Asia, because it's already spreading in Asia. Indonesia adopted legislation in its company's law in 2007 mandating CSR. We still don't know what that means, and it hasn't been implemented. India, Malaysia, Philippines are all considering legislation to mandate CSR. We have no idea what that means. Singapore, not a place where you usually expect non-governmental actors to play a strong role in public policy. In fact, you see some very interesting things happening in Singapore, particularly in areas around human trafficking. Human trafficking in labor supply chains has become a major international issue, and corporations are being told that they are responsible for cleaning up the supply chain, not government regulators. Global Reporting Initiative. Similarly, in the Singapore Stock Exchange last year informed Singapore-based businesses, listed businesses, that they ought to be on a voluntary basis reporting under the Global Reporting Initiative. Strong implication that this was not going to be voluntary all that much longer. So where next? Where does all this leave us in terms of the research agenda? I think we need to be thinking about a research agenda in several ways: to catalog, to categorize, to analyze, and to propose policies that take advantage of this new wave of bringing business into the public policy space. How do we do this rigorously? How do we do this effectively? How do we learn enough about these initiatives? Is something that a whole lot of people in various projects around the world are now struggling with. There's a number of these underway. A couple of us who are here are next week going to Vancouver to do a brainstorming workshop on global health governance and the role of corporations. It will be led by Kelly Lee, who's speaking later today. Many such initiatives are underway, and I would call on the Journal and the Crawford School to consider this as one of the areas where they could be a